Good afternoon. This is Joseph Donnelly from the Jersey Free Public Library. I'm with Tamika Nunley, who is the Associate Professor of History at Cornell University. Her book, At the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C., which came out in 2021, examines African American women's strategies of self-defying in the context of slavery, fugitivity, courts, schools, streets, and the government during the Civil War. This book was named the 2021 Letitia Woods Brown Prize Award for Best Books in African American Women's History. The winner of the 2021 Polly Murray Prize for the Best Books in Black Intellectual History, and a finalist for the ASALH Book Prize, and shortlisted for the MAAH Stone Book Award. She has published countless of articles and views in the journals of Southern History, the William and Mary Quarterly, the Journal of American Legal History, and the Journal of the Civil War. In addition to being a lifetime member of the Association of Black Women's Historians, she serves on the editorial board of Civil War History, the Journal of the Civil War Era, and the Journal of Southern History. She is currently completing a second book, The Demands of Justice, Enslaved Women, Capital Crime, and Clemency in East Virginia, Early Virginia, 1705 to 1865, with the University of North Carolina Press. Her work has been supported by the Andrew Mellon and Woodrow Wilson Foundations, and as well the American Association of University Women. Good afternoon, Professor. How are you today?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
And this is her book, At the Threshold of Liberty. Well, I read this book from cover to back, front to back.
Thank you.
And it was interesting. A lot of it was surprising and shocking. Because we always known Washington, what can you tell us about Washington, D.C. in the beginning? I mean,
yes.
They finally made that the capital of the United States after Washington served in New York and Philadelphia, and they wanted to move it more south to quote unquote keep the Southerners happy.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it was. It was a compromise that many Southerners were really concerned about, having the capital in Philadelphia and New York, in places that would gradually abolish slavery, could possibly pose a threat to the sustainability of slavery as an institution throughout the United States. And so after the American Revolution, when Congress decides that they're going to close the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, that is already a huge blow to the institution of slavery, denying slaveholders the legal right to import people of African descent from abroad. And so, in a lot of ways, George Washington thought that sort of having this place, the capital, be in the middle, kind of geographically, between the states, a kind of middle ground, would be a good compromise. And also, he loved Virginia. He loved Mount Vernon, and he loved the idea of being able to be at Mount Vernon and look across the Potomac and know that the nation's capital would be there. And so Washington, D.C. was carved out of Virginia and Maryland, the oldest slaveholding states in the Union, but also places that were really important politically, right? There is a particular kind of political dynasty that comes from Virginia. And then there's a really important early republic history in Maryland. And so all of the legislators in the nation would have to converge at this site from their respective places and sort of both metaphorically and physically meet in the middle to come together to begin to do the work of governing the nation.
Excellent. I mean, Washington left his term of office in 1797. He didn't see Washington, D.C. at all. It was just swampland and trees and wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And then when John Adams became president, he sort of moved into the White House in the area, but it was not completely built yet. It was still in
Mhm.
reconstruction, and they were using slave labor. Was that?
Mhm.
I think they used a lot of slave labor to build all the important buildings in Washington D.C. and get rid of the forests and the swamps
Mhm.
and
Yes, yes.
yes. Hmm.
Here's the thing, the government did not allocate tremendous amounts of money in order to build the nation's capital, right? They're coming off of the heels of the American Revolution, where inflation is an incredible problem,
Hmm.
and money is worth very little beyond sort of actual assets and staple crops and enslaved people. And so relocating the nation's capital to the place where slavery is actually, most successful, um, and, um, and people are most successful because of their reliance and their dependence upon slave labor. Um, Whether the government sort of wanted to or not, it was going to be a necessity to find a labor pool that was reliable, but one in which they could accommodate financially. And so they relied upon enslaved labor and also immigrant labor eventually throughout the early republic, but they wanted cheap labor, and they but they also wanted skilled labor, right? And so these were people who were masons, right? People who could do stone cutting, who could do the kind of work to build the kind of physical monuments that we would come to associate with the nation's capital. And in addition to that, they needed to populate the nation's capital, and nobody wanted to move there. And so um, it was not the most attractive city. And so, how do you bring people with the kind of financial means that would help grow the city and invest in the city? And it was going to be tapping into the coffers of slaveholders and trying to attract them. And so, a lot of the work that the commissioners were doing were trying to get slaveholders to purchase property in the nation's capital and develop it and make it make it look, architecturally beautiful, make it look like it is a viable place to live. And that's what they did. And they relied on slavery in order to do that.
Excellent. Um, they they abolished slavery in 1808. Is that correct, or was it
They
1804?
abolished the slave trade, right? And
Slave trade.
so they banned Americans from importing people of African descent directly from other parts of the Atlantic. Now, does this stop slaveholders from doing that? Absolutely not. Well into the 19th century, leading up into the American Civil War, we see that there is the smuggling of people of African descent into the United States. But what we also see is a tremendous growth in the population of enslaved people, because enslaved people are forming families, and they are naturally sort of reproducing and populating. And populating the South. And what's interesting is that DC is sort of considered, near the upper South. And by the time that we sort of see the antebellum decades, there's no longer this heavy reliance upon tobacco. They're trying to diversify agriculturally what they are producing, and they don't have the kind of demand for enslaved labor that you would see in the deep South and in the Southwest, where we begin to see the production of cotton and also sugar. And so there's a domestic slave trade, and there's an intra-regional slave trade that's happening, that's making slavery a viable institution throughout the 19th century.
And the domestic slave trade was happening right in DC as well.
Yes.
I mean, and nobody, the president or Congress, but most of Congress was made of Southern gentlemen. Nobody ever thought of stopping it or putting that to an end.
Well, abolitionists definitely targeted.
I mean, the abolitionists wanted to stop it,
Yes,
and
abolitionists and many sort of northern politicians saw slavery as a problem. Even the founding generation knew that slavery was a burden. It was kind of a nuisance, right? It was a nuisance because it really magnified the political contradiction of here we are, this new republic, and we're supposed to embody the virtues, right, of egalitarianism and liberty and equality, and slavery is this huge elephant in the room that very much compromises that message. And so I think that whether you were sort of from the Virginia gentry in the early years, or a northern politician, there were people who expressed discomfort with the presence of slavery and just how fast it was growing. And but there wasn't sort of a real willingness to abolish it. So there were all of these strategies of how do we both accommodate the property interests and the property rights that now slaveholders possess, but also rid ourselves of this burden of this institution of slavery. And so there were lots of different kinds of schemes that were proposed, like colonization. So Washington, D.C. became the site in which many, both Southern and Northern politicians said, well, what if we deported them, right? For those who become free, why don't we gradually emancipate people and eventually deport them because their equal citizenship here is an impossibility and undesirable, right? And then there are people by, the 1830s and 1840s who say, no, we need to immediately abolish slavery by any means necessary and make them citizens of the nation. And so those politics are complex and they evolve over time. But what's interesting about the role of slavery in Washington, D.C. is that it was really important economically to the city. So many of the people who had businesses in the nation's capital were slave traders. And sometimes they were just tavern owners who would then house slave traders, and coffles of enslaved people would provide a protected space for enslaved people before they went down to the deep South and were sold. And so it ended up becoming this really important hub for the domestic slave trade. And so my book talks about how it was not uncommon for you to walk down the National Mall and see and hear enslaved people who were being sold and who were being prepared for transport to the Deep South.
I mean, the African American women took a major role in this, and because they're being separated from their families. I mean, their
Hmm.
children were being sold. They never thought they would see them again. Like Miss Sookie.
Hmm. Hmm.
What can you tell us more about her? I mean, she was an interesting person.
Yeah, so Sookie, she introduces the book, and this is where I think self-definition becomes a very interesting concept. Here I take a typical runaway ad that you would have found in a 19th century newspaper that would alert the community and readers, subscribers, that an enslaved person has escaped. And so here, this woman, Sookie, is laboring in the household of the commandant of the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And she's labored for them for many decades and actually had children. And at a certain point, she leaves. And she leaves and she hires herself out. She's attempting to hire herself out as a free Black woman. And, even the people placing the ad note that she's a really good cook, but she has a sharp tongue. Her mouth is something that gets her into trouble. And even some years prior to her escape, her owners had moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. And she just said, I'm not going to go anywhere where I don't want to go. Right. And so she's already throwing hints that she's not feeling this, that she's going to go and chart a course on her own. And so what's interesting is that, she's referred to as Suri, but then she renames herself Sookie Dean. And so the question that I posed was, at what point did she decide that she was going to escape? right? What sets of deliberations did she have to consider, especially because she had children? And then at what point did she decide what her new name was going to be and how she was going to present herself when she was entertaining different prospective employers? And so, what I want to sort of show is that, we look at these runaway advertisements and we say, yeah, an enslaved person ran away, and this is sort of what they might be doing. And I want us to kind of take a step back and think about sort of the moments in which these women begin to conceptualize their plans, right? That they had always been thinking about freedom. They've been thinking about their identities outside of the context of slavery. And they had aspirations that had nothing to do with slavery, right? And that in itself is something really powerful and helps us to kind of set up the emancipation moment that we learn in school, right? Is the moment where all the enslaved people are freed during the Civil War, right? Let's think about sort of the precursors to that and how enslaved women began to envision freedom for themselves before that really important moment.
Did the Underground Railroad move through Washington D.C. during that time?
Yes, absolutely. The underground vigilance networks that were committed to helping enslaved people escape slavery was alive and well in Washington, D.C.
Mm,
And there was, particularly given D.C.'s geographic proximity to free states like Philadelphia or to like Pennsylvania. Um, these people sort of built this network from all over the North and targeted Washington D.C. and made themselves available to assisting enslaved people in their escapes from that region, and not only in Washington D.C. but also in the surrounding regions, right? And so Maryland is the home of Harriet Tubman, right? And so there's a whole vigilance network there, and then also from Virginia there's a vigilance network there. And so there are all these sort of covert and sort of undercover ways that abolitionists began to target the District of Columbia. And so you have the sort of legislative side, you have the sort of popular culture, print media side of abolitionism, right? And then you have sort of the grassroots organizing that's happening right under the noses of slaveholders, right? And they're trying to figure out how this is happening. And so one of the things that my book tries to convey is that unlike other places in the South, where enslaved women are kind of less likely to escape because of the geographic proximity to freedom, also because they are oftentimes charged with care of kin, right? In DC, that is actually it's actually different because of the geography. That actually enslaved women do run and escape at pretty significant rates, and they run with their families, with babies in tow, with other friends, right? That they gather and assist, and many of them actually return to help others and bring them to freedom as well. And so it actually becomes a very important hub. And I'm able to tell that story in ways that is oftentimes not we're not able to, right? And so, because of the geographic proximity and because of records from people in Philadelphia who were creating an account of people that they were assisting in Washington D.C.
and then we started to develop the fugitive laws,
Hmm.
where if you see a person of an African American woman or an African American man and they don't have a letter saying they're free, you can send them back to their plantations, to their landowners. And it was that was like during the height during of the abolition was because of that. I mean,
Hmm.
really bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because when I say like states' rights, you
Hmm.
think about the South, you think about places that perhaps are a little more politically conservative. But At the time, the federal government, as a compromise, passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 that made Northerners who were on free soil territory accountable and responsible for the return of escaped enslaved people. And in places like Pennsylvania, they began to create their own state laws, like personal liberty laws, that said that no, they don't have to be obligated to return these enslaved people. And so they began to invoke their rights as a state in ways that override the federal law, right? And so they were some of the first, Pennsylvanians were some of the first to invoke states' rights before South Carolina, before other states. And so the abolitionist movement, really put pressure on the federal government to decide how they were going to protect slavery in the states where it existed, but also accommodate the political leanings of Northerners or those who were less sympathetic to slavery.
Now, many African women who were granted their freedoms from their plantation owners were still worried about being like captured by 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 slave owners and send
Mhm.
them back. You know, being
Yeah.
kidnapped and send them back down to the south.
Hmm.
So they feared that a lot,
Yes. So
even though you had a
abduction.
letter didn't mean
Hmm.
anything to them. So, but they weren't. These slave owners were not breaking any laws by capturing. I mean, you were very free. You got your freedom, but they were just grabbing them off the street and saying, "But I have my letter. I don't care." So they sent them back, right?
Yes, yeah. And and many people might be familiar with the popular movie 12 Years a Slave, right? And Solomon Northup, but there are many accounts of free Black people who were unlawfully abducted into the domestic slave trade. And one of the depots that they were probably going to land at were going to be one of the slave pens in Washington, D.C. before they headed further south. And then this continues to be a problem when we get to the American Civil War, and particularly towards the end of the war, where slavery is declared, null and void in the Confederacy in Virginia, and then also by 1864 in Maryland. And even though these people are entitled to their freedom, right, because of the new wartime legislation and emancipation, many of the slaveholders are very resistant. And they try to find very creative ways to force them to remain on their plantations, working for them under the very same conditions. And a lot of those strategies might include the abduction of their children, right? And so even though an enslaved woman is able to gain her freedom by just leaving, right? If a slaveholder has her children locked up, right, then he or she can force them into an apprenticeship, an unconsented apprenticeship, right? They can declare that the mother or father are not equipped to be proper guardians. So there are all these creative ways, even up until the end of slavery, where slaveholders are still trying to maintain their hold on their access to the labor of those enslaved people or formerly enslaved people.
Now let's talk about the African American women and the businesses they ran
Hmm.
in Washington D.C. You know, we had seamstresses, they ran stores,
Hmm.
restaurants, taverns, brothels. Ooh, that was interesting.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I always say that historians treat brothels as like in sex work as this like separate book, right? This separate book that's not about freedom, Black women's freedom and right and what they aspire to. But when you think about it, if formerly enslaved people are gaining their freedom in a society that still sees them as unequal because of their race and because of their gender, what are the professional opportunities available to them after that, right? After they
Mhm.
receive their freedom, right? And so we find that the most successful, sort of financially and socially, Black women that we see are ones who are entrepreneurs. And these are women who kind of take those skills that they've acquired over the years and perfect them and market them very skillfully in the district, and are these really astute business women, like on the cover, Elizabethckley, who many people are already familiar with because of her association with Mary Todd Lincoln. But even when she was enslaved, she learned her trade as a seamstress and became particularly good at making very elaborate pieces for elite women. And so she was very clear about the kinds of clientele that she would work for. It would be the leading ladies of Washington who could pay top dollar for the kind of garments that she's making. And then there were other women like Alethea Tanner, who had this, garden, and then would take her produce and sell it at the market in D.C. And so all of these women were very entrepreneurial because they were not considered as equals in a society that could afford them, right, broader professional opportunities. Many of them became school teachers for Black schools, and many of them also, because of their financial success, became really important patrons of Black institutions, like many of the churches and schools that are still standing today. But then on the flip side of this is that because there are limited opportunities, um, sex work became a very viable one, right? Which tells us that DC had a lot of people who were willing to pay for sexual services and leisure services that may have been seen as inappropriate. And so there's this underground economy that's not so underground because it's proliferated everywhere, right? But what it tells us a lot about sort of what the market demand is in a place like Washington, D.C., which is incredibly fascinating, right? Because most of the people in D.C. are transplants. They're people who are coming there to do the business of government, which will tell you everything you need to know about who can afford these services. And so many of these Black women, go into this business, for some temporarily, just to get on their feet financially. Some had no other choice, right? And this was the only way they could survive. And then some became incredibly financially successful, even though it came at a tremendous risk, right? It comes at the risk of venereal disease. It comes at the risk of being heavily policed, right? And it comes at the risk of being criminalized in Washington society. But it is a very important economic resource for Black women, whether we like to admit it or not. And so there's sort of a broad spectrum, right? Freedom is not just about, oh, right, these Black women gain their legal freedom and then they become these leading race women, right? It's a mix of different pathways that they take. And they're all very important because they show us, right, the very presence of Black women in all of these different spaces. And during the American Civil War, right, they become a problem because when Union soldiers camp out in Washington, D.C., many of them are getting arrested alongside Black women who they are consorting with, right? And so it creates a very tricky dynamic, and it complicates how we understand the Union soldier experience in Washington, D.C.
Now we get up to Harper's Ferry, 1859. We're approaching the Civil War. Things are getting really hot in Washington D.C. and all over the South,
Hmm.
between South and North. You get to the where John Brown takes over Harper Ferry. Said, "I have all these weapons. Rise up and kill the white man, the Southern white
Hmm.
man." That doesn't happen because none of them rise up, and he was captured by the Marine. And the Marines captured him with the help of Robert E. Lee.
Hmm.
And then we have then everything started to change really quick when we had the
The
election of
election. Hmm.
1860, when a lot of southern states, if Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States, we are going to secede from the Union. And sure as happened, Lincoln is elected. 11 states have seceded from the Union, and then you have the firing of Fort Sumter, and that
Hmm.
started the Civil War. And many African women became nurses. That's correct.
Hmm.
And what Can you tell us about that?
Yes, yeah, I don't talk about nurses a ton in my book, mainly because a lot of these nurses, many of them do work in the camps of or the refugee camps in the city, but many of them also go to the South where the Union has gained a foothold in certain parts of the region and volunteer their services there as well. And so Black women during the Civil War are scattered throughout offering their services, particularly during in the refugee camps, because when the Civil War breaks out and we begin to see sort of a series of legislative measures through martial law, through military law, where the Union government is making increasing sort of effort towards emancipating enslaved people, particularly in Confederate territory. And so, with that means that some of those people are going to be flocking to Union lines. And for those who are closest to the Chesapeake, they're going to be flocking to a place like DC, right? And so DC becomes flooded with refugees who come to the city with the expectation that they're going to realize their freedom, that freedom is going to be protected. And so the Black women who are working as nurses continue to support the integration of these refugees into Washington and helping them set up life in Washington, D.C. Oftentimes the government, found themselves sort of, conflicted, right? There are some Union soldiers who were very, who definitely, followed orders and made it so that they could make the best out of a really terrible situation and making these refugees, sort of settled into society, getting them to jobs, getting them fed, right? Dealing with some of their needs, addressing their needs. And then there were some who were hostile to these refugees, who resented them, and in the ways that this war is fought over their status, right, and over who they will become. And so many nurses and many volunteers would have to operate outside of the government, right? And so it becomes the Black churches, the schools, the organizations that Black women create collectively to raise money that provides really essential support for those enslaved people coming to Union lines, particularly to the nation's capital.
Now, let's go back to Elizabeth Keckley,
Mm-hmm.
who's confidant to Mary Todd Lincoln, who is a seamstress,
Mm-hmm.
and she helps Mrs. Lincoln out, and she talks to her and convinces her, talk to her husband about many things.
Mm-hmm.
She was an interesting woman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I know she lost her son during the Civil War because he was
She
killed
did.
because many under Frederick Douglass and many other abolitionists went trying to convince the having African American regiments, which
Mm-hmm.
that was established, and one was under Robert Shaw,
Mm-hmm.
who commanded 54th Massachusetts Regiment, who saw a lot of action, and many other regiments joined up, and they fought for their freedom and fought to end other slavery issues, and so that, and then Lincoln decided he wanted the war was not going well for Lincoln. He wanted to do an emancipation, create a proclamation. He wanted to make it a war maneuver or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
to free the slaves, to get them out of the South. And did Washington D.C. get really busy after January 1st when the Emancipation Proclamation came out?
Yes, well, Washington became very busy when Washington abolished slavery, right, in
Mm-hmm,
1862, just before the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's when the sort of first wave
mm-hmm,
of refugees and formerly enslaved people
mm-hmm,
flocked to the nation's capital from the surrounding region. And then by the time we get to 1863, to the Emancipation Proclamation, we see more of that the traffic of people coming in, right? And DC is already jam-packed because they have Union soldiers, right? It's the
Hmm.
citadel of the Union. It's the fortress of the Union. And so it's already pretty crowded and cramped. And so that becomes the fact increasingly so over time until the end of the war. And Elizabethckley, to the first part of your question, is a very leading figure in Washington, D.C. Social life, both in Black social life and also in social life among white residents of the city, particularly elite white women who are a part of the social season, who are a part of the political elite. Um, would have sought out her design services because she was seen as the go-to person. When you had an event to go to or a levee to attend, you were going to tap Elizabethckley if she was available for you, right? And she was very influential, and she was very she was very sort of socially very sophisticated in the sense that she knew how to weave in between both the circles of elite white women, but also sort of the broader Black elite community of Washington, D.C., who was primarily comprised of formerly enslaved people and some people who were born free for many generations and who had worked really hard to build Black schools, Black churches, institutions, and who saw themselves as a really important political voice in the city. And so Keckley knew how to navigate both of those worlds very well and landed at the White House at a particularly important moment, which is interesting because she was also the seamstress to Verena Davis, Jeff Davis's wife.
Heard.
And so she would cater to clients across the political spectrum, which I could only imagine provided incredible insight for people who were gossipy or wanted to know more about Keckley's interactions with Verena or with other women who were from the South and who had become a part of the Confederacy. So she had a politics and she was very politically astute, but she was also socially really important. And so when Lincoln is deliberating over emancipation, I really believe that he's undoubtedly impacted by the Black people, particularly the leading voices of the Black elite in Washington, D.C., who are advocating for this to be a war that ends slavery. And and so it's interesting that the presence of Black people during the Civil War increasingly coming to the nation's capital absolutely has political significance.
As we're approaching the end of the Civil War, Lincoln wanted to pass the 13th Amendment,
Hmm.
and which went through the Senate, and that was going through the House, and it was finally ratified. And that means which was I guess, how was everybody's reaction to that? Does it? I think I missed that in the book. I mean, do you know offhand? Well, in
Well,
DC.
I don't spend a lot of time on the 13th Amendment. I
Hmm.
talk about it and then I talk about its limits.
Hmm.
Right. And so what you have is this dynamic where the administration, because it's filled with radical Republicans at this point, and all the dissenting voices are pretty much in the Confederacy, um, that you have this radical government who is passing these unprecedented measures, which is really important and really sets in motion the possibility of what freedom could be. But on the ground is a whole nother story, right? And
Yes.
so the DC Emancipation Act is passed in 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Maryland as a state finally begins to pass emancipation measures in 1864, right? And then we get the Reconstruction Amendments, right? After the war. And what's happening is that these new laws need to keep getting passed because the scaffolding of slave law is so rigid and strong, and has been a part of the fabric of the nation since its inception, that it actually becomes really hard to unravel on the ground. And a lot of this has to do with property rights. And so I talk about this, right? That white loyalists to the Union invoke their property rights as slaveholders, right? And don't believe that this war needs to be a war about the end of slavery. It needs to be about a war about bringing the Confederacy back into the Union, right? And so they fundamentally disagree with this. So even though you have this radical government who's passing this, unprecedented legislation, the American people, right, are mixed on this, right? And for many, they are opposed to this because so much of their financial assets are built into, right, the bodies of enslaved people, right? And so this completely wipes this out for them, right? For those who don't have as much, property in enslaved people, it may not be as significant. Now, the other issue is the issue of equality, right? And so this is why we need this, the 14th Amendment, right? And this is why we need other legislative responses to ensuring the civil rights of Black people. Some people are okay with emancipation, but think that Black people should get out of there, get out of the United States, right? And so they struggle not with freedom, but they struggle with racial equality, right? And so there's multiple layers and dimensions to the emancipation moment that Black people are up against in ways that are quite formidable. And we see this because by the end of the 19th century, we see the rise of Jim Crow segregation, right? And we see this desire to return back to the social norms of racial inequality that slavery created. And so these legislative measures are really important and critical, but on the ground it becomes harder. And so I tell the stories of Black women who know that they're legally free, but slaveholders are like, no, you're not, right? Or they take your children, right, to force you back onto the plantation. And by the time they do that, there are no laws that enforce, right, equal wages, right, and free labor yet, right? It's just freedom, but like the free labor laws are not yet in place at that moment either, right? And so there's so much legal scaffolding that created slavery that now has to be undone, right? And more legislation has to be passed both at the state and federal level. The federal level does a great job of making sure that that legislation is passed, but then getting the states to comply is a whole nother beast.
Because did you ever see the movie Lincoln?
Yes.
Daniel Day-Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
When he was in his office and two people came from Missouri, and the Secretary of State asked him, "How would you feel if Lincoln passed the 13th Amendment and freeing the slaves? Would you?" And they said, "Well, if that would help end the war, that'd be great. But what if the war ended today?" And I was like, "Then we don't want it because they would take businesses and jobs away."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was like, wow.
Yes.
Now, okay, the Civil War has come to an end. Lee surrendered Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Lincoln sets up the Freemens Bureau.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Lincoln dies, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and then Andrew Johnson takes over. They talk a lot about the Freemens Bureau. Tell us more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, the issue that I spoke to about sort of this radical Republican government knows that these laws need to be passed. They also realize that on the ground, freedom is very challenging, right? And so they need this kind of federal bureaucracy that is going to help sort of set freedom in motion and get these people placed away from bondage, connected to family members in schools, right? Gaining literacy and getting placed with jobs. And so the Freedmen's Bureau becomes this big federal umbrella that has these regional agencies throughout the South to assist freed people in realizing freedom, right? And so the first thing that enslaved people need to know is that they're free and that this is law, right? And this is protected by the federal government, right? And so this is the work that these agents do. The other thing that they do is they try to enforce, right, through federal power to say that these people are free, let them go, right? So you have a lot of these field agents who are writing letters on behalf of enslaved women who are appealing to the Freedmen's Bureau to say that this slaveholder will not let my family member go or will not let me go, right? And they are then able to write a letter on their behalf to say that you must let these people go, right? And if you don't, you have the right to access the Union military in order to enforce it, right? So the presence of the Freedmen's Bureau is only as effective as Union soldiers are on the ground still, right? And able to support those measures or enforce those measures.
And the Freemen's Bureau doesn't last too long, does it? It lasted for a year or so, year or two.
Yes, but the soldiers who are there for a little bit longer, right?
Mhm.
In during Reconstruction,
Military reconstruction.
during military Reconstruction, right? And so there are other sort of federal forces on the ground that are able
Hmm.
to do the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so this is interesting because this is where the federal government becomes way more heavy-handed than ever before, right? And so we've got intelligence now. We have a very different kind of military infrastructure, right? You have a bureaucratic infrastructure for pensions now that becomes really important to this generation of people, and also to Black women making claims to pensions because of either their involvement as volunteers or also male relatives who served in the military who can't collect their pensions. Um, so it becomes important on the ground to sort of situate these what freedom looks like, and also combat the resistance that is still mounting even as the war is over. Even though the war is technically over, the war isn't over, right? And so the battles are still being waged on the ground.
Because Andrew Johnson, when he became president of the United States, he didn't seem to care about what was going on with all these laws and black codes. He just wanted
Mhm.
vengeance. He wanted to create military construction. He wanted tribunals, but he didn't have any feeling towards the African Americans.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Johnson really wanted to focus on ending the war and making sure that a war didn't happen again,
Hmm.
right? And so this was making it not as challenging for former Confederates to be reintegrated into to society, and former Confederate states to be reintegrated into the Union. And so if that meant compromising on some of the radical Republican policies, right, and aspirations for Reconstruction, he was willing to do that. And so this is goes back to the point of, like, some people were advocates for freedom and knew that slavery was a problem for the nation. But that doesn't mean that they were champions of racial equality. That doesn't mean that they wanted African Americans to be a part of the United States, despite the fact that they had been,
Hmm.
right? And so that's where you begin to see the political nuances of people who were for the Union. Being for the Union cause was not sort of a blanketed acceptance of Black people, or an acceptance of freedom, even, right? And so the real sort of imperative that united people across the regions and across the political spectrum was reunification,
Hmm.
right? And we see that more and more towards the end of the 19th century.
And most of the southern states came back into the Union around the early 1870s, and New Orleans was the last city for military to leave. And when the military and all left, what did many of the African Americans feel about that?
When the military left,
Yeah, because most all the southern states was readmitted into the Union, and everything thought there was going to be changes, but then there wasn't, and there's a lot of
mhm. Well, that happens much later,
Hmm.
beyond the scope of the book.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry.
And
I went
so
too
it,
far.
it, it happens, it happens after African Americans have experienced
Hmm.
being able to vote, have experienced being able to participate in society as citizens and as politicians, right?
Hmm.
We have our first Black senators, right, and congressmen and people holding really important political positions. And it's when Reconstruction ends, right, that we begin to see, right, more of the violence of white vigilantes, right, in the South, who are trying to intimidate Black people who appear successful, right, who are enjoying the fruits of freedom and citizenship. And these white vigilantes want to restore Southern society back to its antebellum hierarchy, right? And put Black people back into their place. And what it does is it sets in motion a 100-year fight, right, for civil rights, right? And so countless people lose their lives, right? A lot of the sort of promising signs that we saw with Reconstruction are now diminishing, right, in the forms of lynching, right, in the forms of convict leasing, rampant poverty, sharecropping and debt peonage, right? And so that effort to restore society back to where it was in the antebellum South, right, has tremendous consequences for Black lives for the next 100 years afterwards.
So, final note. Do you have an, in conclusion, you have anything to tell us that we should know?
Yes,
So,
yeah. I think that's a great way to sort of talk about the title of the book, right? This is why these women are at the threshold of liberty, right? They're not quite crossing the threshold of liberty yet, because there is a very rigorous fight, right, to exclude Black women, Black men, right, on the basis of race, on the basis of sex, right, to ensure that they don't access full equality and citizenship in the nation, and they continue to struggle for liberation in these very creative ways. And I think they can tell us something, right, about the nation's history and about the limits of liberty, right, and the exclusive nature of liberty throughout the 19th century. And so, thank you so much for these wonderful questions and for engaging and reading the book. And I hope that it illuminates some things that maybe we don't always talk about.
right. And thank you for your time. And especially since you're about to be expecting
Yes,
a
yeah, I'm about to
baby.
welcome another little girl. Yes, yeah.
And I'm just glad you were be able to came on today, and
With
nothing
no incident.
with no incidents. Okay, and thank you very much for your time. And your book was wonderful, and I enjoyed it. You
Thank
know,
you.
and we hope to see you again in the near future for your next one.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Okay,
the invitation.
you have a good day now, and
You too.
I'll, have a good day, and I'll talk to you much sooner later.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank
Have a
you.
good day, and bye bye.
Bye bye.